Live
Live
streaming is
streaming
on.
is on.
Hello, Global Theater. My name is Jerry Fialka. Today is April 22, 2022. We want to thank Clinton Ignatoff and his amazing podcast, Concerned Medicine. Thank you so much, Clinton. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here with Patrick McGee. Where are you calling in from, Patrick?
Seattle.
Well, let's just jump right into it. What's the best thing for a human being?
um, Peace.
Peace. I love that word, man. I rarely get that word. Patrick, what's your favorite form of information, how it comes into you?
I guess I have to say digital.
Digital. Wow.
Well, because I include everything in that category: books, news, everything.
Yeah. Why do you think humans collect or gather information?
To expand their minds, I hope.
I have that same aspiration, and I love the word expand. Do you think this need or want to collect information is more innate or more invented?
Well, I think there's some degree of innateness in the sense that we have the material capacity for it, but we invent it as we move along. Would be my view. We alter it, expand it, make it more precise.
Do thoughts create emotions?
My philosophy is that thought and emotion are more or less the same thing. I'm a Spinozist sort of, and so the physical, the mental, it's all one thing.
Yeah, well, I tend to say that you can't separate feeling head from heart or feeling from thinking, but we invented the words so we think we can separate them.
Yeah.
Is thinking more innate or more invented?
Well, I mean, obviously it's innate to some extent, because we have the physical capacity for it, even though in reality, I don't think we actually know what it is that we have, that we're doing when we think. But like I said, the ground of it is innate, the potential for it. But what we do with it has to be invented and reinvented continually. So both innate and
that's good.
Invented.
Yeah. No, I like that because it reminds me of the Marx Brothers are in a jam and one of them says, we got to think. And the other one says, hey, we already tried that. And yeah, Captain Beefheart says, I've had too much to think.
Well, we all have that problem sometimes.
Yeah. But Patrick, can you fill in the blank, please? I don't know what I think until I
write it.
All right. I got that from McLuhan says, I don't know what I think until I say it. And Joan Didion says, I don't know what I think until I write it. Yeah.
I think it differs for different people,
Yeah. Can humans think without language?
That's a good question. And I'm sort of betwixt and between on that one because I think language is thought. But at the same time, I've come to the conclusion that everything is thought. Physical actions are thought because you look at a person and things they do and the way they move and the way they express themselves physically is just as much of a thought. I mean, just really quickly, I have an autistic niece who's very, very severe, on the spectrum. And there are times when I'm watching her and I can feel her communicating physically, through her expressions, and her gaze. She has a particular way of looking at things, so, but I don't believe that thought is some sort of ethereal you know, thing out there. I mean, I sometimes use the word spirit, but I don't mean it in a kind of religious sense. Go ahead.
No, that was good. It brought up a lot. In fact, I know we'll be dabbling in the James Joyce world a little. And just off the top of my head, you saying that, observing your niece, do you think Joyce, as some have suggested, was really influenced writing Finnegan's Wake by watching his daughter dance around?
Well, I think it had some impact on it. I mean, he was already working on it, I think, before she started dancing, but I'm not
Yeah.
totally sure about that date. But um, I mean, I think he saw in her, you know, stuff that fed into his work, you
Yeah.
know, and but I think it was more along the lines that, you know, he saw her. I think he must have realized pretty early on that she had issues, problems, you know, but he saw things in her that, you know, to him were aesthetic, were artistic, you know, and I don't know how much influence it would have had on his writing though, because I think his writing grew out of its own process. You know, if that makes any sense. Uh,
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And Chomsky says a language is not just words. It's a culture, a tradition, a unification of community, a whole history that creates what a community is.
mhm.
Patrick, what do you do when language doesn't work? When language breaks down, what do you do?
For me, language always breaks down. I
Well,
mean, you
give me,
know,
yeah, like one
I
of
mean,
your strategies. How do you deal with it? You're a professor, a communicator. What's like one strategy you turn to when it breaks down?
well, I can say as a teacher, um, and you know, I don't know that my style was necessarily the best style, but the way I worked was I would resort to a lot of anecdotes. Um,
Yeah.
you know, I would tell stories, and I was usually teaching critical theory or Joyce or Blake or someone,
Yeah.
and I found that by you know as much as I could making things concrete and then drawing it back into the abstract because I think I do believe in the value of the abstract, but yeah, that's what I'm sort of famous for as a teacher is telling a lot of anecdotes. I also got my students to like I would be teaching theory courses, and you know, in America, you teach these kids and they've never read an abstract text throughout their entire high school career. You know, so it's very difficult for them. And I would get them to do skits, you know, and so to sort of translate it into a more physical language. I can't say that that necessarily communicated exactly what I was trying to get across, but it helped. It helped them be more comfortable, you know, with the material they were working with. But language for me always fails. I mean,
Yeah.
it's an ongoing process. You're just continually picking it up.
It's really well put. I appreciate your words and you're articulate and you really get what I'm after here. And again, this is a stupid question. It's both and it depends. And you sort of already answered it, but your observations of humans, are we more thinking beings or more feeling beings?
Well,
And again, I know what you said, we can't separate them, but just like an overall generalization, how would you?
I would actually say that ultimately we're more feeling.
Yeah,
Um, it's kind of like that line in King Lear. I think it's Gloucester, something to the effect of "who do not know because they do not feel." Because in some ways, if you don't feel something, you won't know it either. You can know something abstractly, but not know it in terms of you know the
yeah,
emotional impact of it.
really well put. And these are two questions from Alan Turing. If is thinking a function of the soul?
It depends on what you mean by soul. I mean, I would argue that I, thinking is the soul, as far as
Yeah,
I'm concerned. You know, I don't, you know, believe in the milk bottle. I was raised Catholic, so we all had to see these milk bottles with little spots on them to represent sins. But I think the power of thought is what constitutes the spirit of human beings. You know, but I don't mean thought as something that only a few people can do. I mean, obviously, everyone thinks, even when they don't know it.
Totally agree. Now, I was raised Roman Catholic too, and I'm not quite remembering Charlie Christian or what was that guy, the Charlie Bubble or whatever they were teaching us. But the milk bottle in your metaphor was what you were referring to as represents the soul, and then there's spots on it. Tell me.
Yeah, like little spots are venial sins and big spots are mortal sins.
Right.
This is what, like you're in the second or third grade and they give you a catechism and they brainwash you.
But you did mention the word spirit before. How would you differentiate between spirit and soul? Are they pretty much one the same, or do you differentiate them?
Well, I guess I don't differentiate them that much. I don't really use the word soul that much, except in the context of, say, jazz or blues or something like that, because sometimes I use the word soul in the sense of soul music, but I also see it as a larger thing about human beings. So I guess they're kind of the same. For me, spirit, I think of the German word Geist, and spirit is intellect. And it's also, for me, a kind of communal thing, is that we think we're thinking everything out of a sort of a fundamental source, but the reality is that we're all being fed into by millions of other sources: our parents, our books, television, whatever goes into the eye or the ear, and obviously there are moments that one feels are spiritual, but for me, those moments are moments of sort of intellectual realization, or illumination even. But for me, it's not. I just don't believe in some sort of metaphysical thing, that lives in us, that's separate from our bodies and our senses.
Is that illumination word similar to what Joyce called epiphanies?
Definitely.
Yeah.
Although Joyce, I think, meant something kind of very specific, but it was the way in which something extremely concrete, not at all abstract, could somehow convey an emotion and a thought that, were, irreducible, could not be really expressed any other way.
Yeah. The other Turing question, Patrick, is, can machines think?
I don't know, but I'm inclined to think it's possible, personally. I mean, it's, I guess, we are machines.
Yeah.
In a way. And I think we're very complex machines. And if they make a machine so complex, the possibility is there.
Yep. Do you more pursue happiness or more pursue meaning?
I guess I would have to say meaning. Happiness for me it's an off and on thing. It comes and goes,
Yeah.
It's, meaning is something it's a long-term process. Again, I guess the word process is rather big with me. So,
dude, that's there's no right or wrong answers to any of these questions, but that one you got right. I got it from Viktor Frankl, and he basically says meaning lasts and happiness doesn't necessarily last. So does the brain more detect consciousness or create consciousness? Like, is consciousness there bubbling away and we're actually detecting it, or are we creating it?
I don't think consciousness is separate, so I guess I would be closer to the idea that we are creating it.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that's
What's
quite it, though. But go
Yeah,
ahead.
no, it's interesting because I'm out to reword my questions. The more word is funny because some of these early questions, is it more this or more that? And a woman a month ago says, the word more doesn't function in your question. And I was thinking about it this morning riding my bike. Should I change the word brain to, because if you say the brain creates consciousness or detects us, that's one thing. If you say the body, the human, do we more, it implies this thing like the brain is not the mind. We tend to think, well, it's the mind is different. So what's faster, speed of light or speed of thought?
For me, speed of light, because my thought processes are slow.
Well, you're doing great. Here's Audre Lorde, the poet, said, you can't dismantle the master's house using the master's tools. Yvonne Rainer responded and said, you can if you expose the tools. The basic question is, what new tool do you suggest? But again, just to put in a little context, I open some of these questions with cute quotes. It's you put the question in the context you want. You don't have to say. And really, the basic question is, what tool do you gravitate towards? And if you want to put the adjective new tool, that's fine. And if you want to apply it to dismantling the master's house, that's fine too.
Well, I love that quote by Audre Lorde.
Yeah.
I don't know that I completely agree with it, but largely agree with it. I mean, I think, I don't think we can, it's funny because I'm kind of a Marxist, okay, to some extent.
Yeah.
And, but I don't believe in violence. And I don't believe we can alter the world or alter the culture or any of these things through violence. And to me, violence is the master's primary tool, especially something we're very aware of at the moment. But I think you can apply it to a lot of different things. I mean, for me, there's no one tool, but each of us has a particular strength of one sort or another. And I think it's important not to neglect that. I was recently reading Richard Wright, and he was writing about, he was being seduced into the Communist Party. And he realized that they just weren't going to let him develop his writing the way he wanted to. So he got out. And it wasn't that he completely disagreed with the conceptual goals, but he knew that whatever he had to give, it was going to be through a medium that he knew he had where he had a strength. That was his tool. And which I thought that's very similar to my own experiences in life, particularly with the left, is that I had to make decisions at different points that I was going to, for example, get an education, and then do something, write, do something and teach. And, sometimes, as a teacher, I took a lot of risk, I think, seems to me at any rate. And as a scholar, I tried to write books that I thought, would have a certain kind of impact. I knew they wouldn't necessarily be popular or big sellers, but something that would last. And I believe that's more important than, I march on the streets and do all this stuff too, but to me, that's more important. So I think there's a lot of ways of spinning that idea, but I think it's a brilliant, formulation by Audre Lorde, because we can't simply imitate. And historically, that's what so often has been done. I mean, that's what the Russian Revolution became, an imitation of the very thing they were trying to overthrow, which makes it, for me, a tragedy. Anyway.
Well, you touched on so many things we're going to dig into deeper, but it really evoked, for me, George Lakoff saying when Occupy started, he says, we got to use the existing tools and invent new ones. And there they were with pizza boxes and felt mark posters. And they were really sort of not inventing, but they were saying we can do live TV with these little cell phones and
Uh-huh.
broadcast live and do the human microphone. So they were really doing that both ways, you know. But you saying, yeah, I march, it's like, yeah, I march anti-war most of my life, but like at this point, I'm too old to be hit by a rubber bullet. Sorry.
Well, I wasn't going to get COVID either, so.
Yeah, yeah, or whatever, you know. I mean, but I love you. You really know how to suss out what I'm talking about here. I appreciate it. What do you worry about when you go to bed at night?
Um, like most people, I live from day to day, and I started. I don't know if you know. I think you know this maybe that I've been writing a long poem for the last 4.5 years or so, and so the things I think about are whether I'm making any progress, whether I'll finish it before I die, because at my age, death becomes sort of a daily possibility, and and of course, like most people, I have petty, utterly irrelevant idiocies that will sometimes clog my brain late at night. But
well, no, that was good, Patrick. But I'm going to interject this one question that I usually ask later. Can you forget to die?
Can I forget to die? Can I forget that I'm dying, or just forget to die?
That's very interesting. See, this is what I love about the questions. I'm always willing to reword them or let the person reword them. Like Rebecca Solnit says so well, just because you ask a question doesn't mean I have to answer it. So, yeah, again, you put it in the context you want, because it is very interesting how those words work.
Well,
yeah, go ahead.
Just concerning death. I mean, when I was fairly young, I was about 30 years old. And, my life up to that point had been kind of all over the place, kind of messed up in some ways. And, but I was married, I had a little kid, and I was in grad school in California. And, I suddenly started having these real feelings, like fear of death, suddenly took over, and it you disappeared for a second.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, you had fear of death at age 30. That's where we cut off. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Well, I think that's not so uncommon, because that's when you realize you're not immortal. And but as you get closer to death, I find that I have a much more pragmatic view of it. I could almost imagine someone forgetting to die if it were possible, simply to forget to do it. Because it would be so, irrelevant. Unfortunately, between, thinking about death and actually dying, there's sometimes a great deal of pain, and nobody wants to go through that.
Yeah. Very good. So McLuhan learned from Ezra Pound that artists are the antenna of the race. They're broadcasting and detecting the hidden psychic effects of our inventions, so that we might be able to cope with what we don't like. So I asked you the question McLuhan probed most of his life. Why do we ignore the hidden psychic effects of our inventions, even though the artists are broadcasting them to us?
I don't know that I know the answer to that, but I really consider that an amazing insight, because, one of the things some years ago I wrote, the movie Titanic came out, and everyone saw it as this big romance thing. And I saw it in very, very different terms. I saw it as this incredible metaphor for, the desire to destroy the class system. I can't think of any other way to put it, at the moment. And I wrote this long essay about it that I later rewrote for another book. But one of my ideas about cinema in particular, but I think it's true of all art forms to some extent, is that they convey to us unconscious elements of our own desires that we often don't want to admit to. And when you look at cinema in particular, see with I guess what you could call high art or autonomous works of art or whatever. Um, there's a greater degree of critical consciousness, and consequently, a lot of people don't get into it. They don't want to dig into that thing. But with popular culture, music and cinema, people go to see these things, and they're connecting with them in some way, and the images that I get out of these things are far more radical than what's coming out of surveys of what people think. So I am convinced that they're connecting with these things that they would say they don't even agree with, in practice. Even though I wrote a book about Westerns, Hollywood Westerns, and part of my idea was that, people talk about the Westerns, it's really conservative because it's very masculine centered and so forth and so on. But the Western is the one film genre that is about property, almost exclusively. It's about property and who has a right to it, and conflicts over it. And again, I realize it's not quite the most popular genre it was, but for many, many decades, it was the most popular Hollywood film genre. And, that was connecting with something in people, and I just see it all the time, whether you're talking about gender, class, or whatever it is, these messages are coming through. But then on the other hand, you turn around and you see the same people who are going to see these movies, getting all this stuff, and then saying things that are completely contrary to what I have to feel they really want,
Right.
And how to deal with that is, there's no simple answer,
Yeah.
we just have to keep trying.
Yeah. Well put. Let's do a whole salon on cinema sometimes, because I took four major notes there, but I'll end it with, Sidney Lumet. They said, "Can films do anything?" He says, "They can't do diddly squat, but I ain't going to keep me from trying."
Well, that's the best way to put it.
It's a beautiful aspiration, because he really did make socially concerned films, and it goes on and on. But your first one with Titanic reminded me of my theory about Magnificent Ambersons, and I've talked to several major Wells people, and I said, "Hey, Rockefeller hijacked the message of Magnificent Ambersons by shipping Orson to Brazil to make the doc, and then said, that's all right, you can still edit it." And then they hijacked the whole story, and it didn't diss the bourgeois. And people still think that's a great film. It's like, yeah, but they fucking changed the whole message, and he hated that they changed it. So anyways, that it's very interesting what you brought up, because there's so many layers to it. But just, and in my question sometimes is, do films create false expectations? Because these working class people were going to cinema to see Fred Astaire dance around and have a good time, so then they could go toil and sweat in the factory and live, now is that good or bad? Well,
That's like the idea that cinema is sort of like the opium of the people or something.
Yeah.
Instead of inspiring them to fight for the things they want, it inspires them to live them vicariously. But I don't buy that myself.
Yeah.
I think, I think they went to see Fred Astaire because it was an image of freedom to them.
Yeah.
The ability to do things, and there's so many different things you get out of films. That I can't even begin to sum it all up.
No, but let I'm serious. Let's sometime do a salon just on cinema, because it'll come up throughout this discussion. I appreciate it. Mm-hmm. Do artists have moral obligation?
I don't like the word moral too much. I would guess I would say ethical obligation, but I mean, it isn't so much they have it. Is that the impulse to art, to my mind, is, however strange this may sound, it's about the will to truth, or the desire for truth. And, I mean, I suppose one could create a work of art, something that's called a work of art that was um, unethical or immoral or something
Yeah.
like that. But from some point of view, but for me, if it was truly immoral
Yeah.
or unethical or indifferent to those, then it wouldn't be art. But I'm a kind of Nietzsche in this respect too, and I think art is beyond good and evil, in the sense that it's beyond simplistic, codes of good and bad.
Yeah.
That it's real art, even when it's the most negative, is affirmative.
Yeah.
Um,
Well,
so I,
I was gonna bring up Louis Buñuel really quick because
Mhm.
he has juvenile delinquents in the streets of Mexico beating up blind wino and is that or Pasolini or any of these filmmakers that dabble in these worlds that
Mhm.
is that I love you switching to saying ethical or moral obligation, do they? And even like my friend saw Blue Velvet and said, "Well, I know I understand it's a good film, but I don't want to spend 2 hours of my life with those kind of people." you know? But in all I always say is Lynch is just a Louis Buñuel wannabe. But Louis said this statement, and you brought up with the word truth, is he says, "I'm for anyone who seeks the truth, but I part ways when they claim they found it."
Yeah, I like that though,
Yeah,
because for me, truth again, I go back. You know, I, well, I'm kind of anticipating what you may ask me later, but the philosopher I'm most interested in these days is a French guy, Alain Badiou,
yeah,
and he basically thinks of truth as an infinite process, and he means
yeah,
infinite in a mathematical sense, not in a sort of a religious sense. And so, I mean, to me, truth is a process, and it's really hard to communicate this to people because
yeah,
people think of truth as a statement, like a
yeah,
proposition, and it's either true or not true. And there's some truth to that. But the thing is that it's kind of like saying freedom. Freedom is a good thing. Yeah, but everyone's concept of freedom can be quite different, and
yeah.
working out those conflicts. So, um,
But that
truth.
was good. How do
Mhm.
you spell Badiou's last name, just so people know?
Badiou, it's Badiou.
Very
Alain.
good. No,
Yeah.
that was really good, and I appreciate that. Um, are you more afraid of new ideas or more afraid of old ideas?
Uh, Well, I'm not afraid of new ideas if they're really ideas. I mean, if they're offer anything new. A lot of times, old ideas are in fact new ideas in
Yeah.
the context in
Yeah.
which we're living. So,
Patrick, can you conjure up your earliest memory ever or one of them?
well, I have some of mine are kind of scary. So, I have this harmless image. I don't know if I'm imagining or not, but for most of my life, I have this image of myself in a bassinet or something, a basket or something, And I have, I mean, I don't know if you want me to go into it. I've got 4 or 5 images from my early childhood, that are not images, they're little events, and, one of them I even doubt it's reality, but the others I believe are true. Um, but I mean, you don't want me to go into that, do you? I mean,
Well, why don't you just describe one of them briefly, either the one you don't know or, whatever. If you want to describe one a little, because in the basket was good, but people, give me a couple more context
well,
to it.
I had one event that stayed with me for many years. I'm with this kid, and we live in South Memphis, Tennessee, right?
Yeah.
And you know, um, where my father has I think it was an old Plymouth. This is like in the early '50s, and so me and this kid get in my father's car. I don't know what possessed me to do that because I was terrified of my father. he would have killed me. But we get in there, and this kid has this bright idea. Says, "Hey, how'd you like to be branded?" And I didn't know what the hell he was talking about. So he pushes in the car lighter, pulls it out, pow, right into my arm. And
Oh my God.
and the thing is, I don't. My memory is, it could be wrong. It didn't even hurt, you know.
Wow. No.
But I knew something was wrong, so I went in to my mother. Was in the house, and I said, "Look, Mom," and she screamed. And when she screamed, then I felt the pain.
Oh my.
I have other
That
memories, but that's the most dramatic one.
That is really an amazing
I couldn't
description.
have been more than 4 or 5 or something
Wow.
like that. You know.
And so do you think memory is more a curse or more a blessing?
I think I can't see memory as a curse. I mean,
Yeah.
it's a blessing, but it's a hard thing. You know, I've written. It's never been published, but I wrote a kind of a memoir novel thing, and in the process, and this was 20 years ago. I'm still planning someday on going back and working on it again, but and I realized in the process how problematic memory is. I mean, you think you remember things, but then do you really know that? And it's really tricky when you start writing about people, you know,
Yeah.
and then maybe sharing it with. I shared it with a few people who were in it, and they usually weren't offended or anything. Although sometimes I could say things that were pretty rough.
Yeah.
But you know, with some of my siblings, the memories just weren't the same. Some people thought this was their memory, not my memory. You know, stuff like that. So I know that memory is really tricky. You know, we reinvent ourselves, and you know, you just have to live with that. Though, I mean, I don't think, but I don't think it's a curse. I think it's just fundamental to being alive. You know, if we didn't
Yeah.
have memory, we'd just be blind. You know, stumbling
Yeah.
along. You know.
Yep. So Patrick, thank you. Tell me someone within your immediate family and then outside your immediate family, just briefly, who was like a role model or had an impact on you. And again, just briefly, what specifically was that impact?
Okay, can I take this as not just now, but you know, in my life, my whole life?
It's mainly asking early in your life,
Okay.
someone in your immediate family, outside your immediate family. But again, you don't have to keep it in that context. It can be
Yeah.
someone through in other parts of your, sometimes people go their spouse,
Yeah.
and that's fine. It's
Mhm.
whatever context you feel you want to say.
Well, in the context of, you know, my early formation, I mean, and there's no doubt about this. My mother is the biggest influence on me. I mean, my mother was a very complex, um, remarkable person, but not a person with a lot of education or stuff like that. But she was unique. I mean, my mother was vehemently anti-racist in the 1950s in Memphis, Tennessee, where nobody that I knew was anti-racist, you know, and she raised us that way. And and she was while she had not a lot of education, she was very smart, and and she was very meditative, and but she also suffered from mental illness, so there were complexities to this, you know.
Yeah.
Outside of my mother, the other great influence on me was a professor at Memphis State University that I went to, and his name was Mark Orr, and he's in the poem. He actually is in. He's one of my guides in the first book of this poem I'm writing, and he was a medieval Renaissance historian, but he was the most remarkable. And I've had some incredible teachers. I mean, I've had the leading Marxists in the United States, Frederick Jameson. I mean, I've had all kinds of incredible teachers, particularly at UC Santa Cruz. But this was the most significant teacher I ever had, and he just I don't even know how to explain it. I mean, my whole teaching style is to some extent derived from him, except that I could never be exactly what he was. He just had this incredible force and power, and he was the one that told me I could write, and which, you know, I didn't have a whole lot of. I didn't come from a background where you came out having a lot of confidence about things like that. So those are probably the two most influential people in my life, my mother and this man.
Really, really well put. So you already said you were raised a Roman Catholic. At
Mhm.
some point, did you check out? The main question is, do you pray now?
Not really. No. I mean, I like to think that, that in some ways the things I write are kind of prayer at times,
Yeah,
but I don't believe in a transcendent God. Um,
yeah,
I do believe in, you know, in a way, it's like in the AA thing,
yeah,
a higher power. But for me, the higher power would not be an invisible, transcendent God. It would be what I call after Spinoza and other people, the multitude, the whole of humanity. Uh, because I think that um, the power of thought isn't limited to any one individual. It's all of us, interconnecting in various ways, and that's a higher power for me. Um, so I
yeah.
don't
No,
think I don't think I'm a pantheist, but
yeah.
it can be sort of related to pantheism.
I like that. And again, this is sort of a stupid follow-up question, but I got to ask it because I ask everybody: is
Mhm.
if God exists, what would you like God to say to you after you die?
That's a hard one. It's like, uh, okay, I know where you fucked up. Oh, I'm sorry, am I not supposed to talk this way? But you didn't do that much damage. So.
That's good. I know where you fucked up. That is good. You can say, "Yeah, I know where you fucked." Okay. Do evil people exist, or does evil use people as a vehicle?
Those are hard questions too. I have to say, I guess that I know some people think you're not supposed to use the word evil because it's got this moral
Yeah.
connotation, some sort of absolute. I think evil people exist. Um, but I don't think evil people think they're evil
Yeah.
ever. I don't. Um, but I like again. This is where this philosopher Badiou has influenced me a lot. Is it he defined evil as the betrayal or subversion of a truth process, and it's also evil when you work to eradicate the infinite um, and force the finite. And if I can explain briefly what I mean by that, is that
Please, please.
yeah, like nationalism is very finite, right? Because if you're a pure nationalist, then anything outside of that nation is excluded automatically. It's kind of like the idea that torture is okay as long as we don't do it in the United States. Um, that's finite. The infinite is to recognize that if something is true, it must be true for everyone. And if it has no power to be true for everyone, the concept itself, then it can't be true. And so, like, the torture is a good thing, can't be true.
No,
It just can't be. And, war is, I mean, I'm not saying war may not be necessary in some instances, but war is the most finite of all things
yeah,
because it's out to destroy the other. Um,
yeah.
so, anyway, that's.
No, that was really good. I actually totally agree with you, and you again articulate. The follow-up question really is how do you advise someone to deal with an enemy? And this one I set up with a few modern thinkers' thoughts. Alan Watts says, if you acknowledge your enemy, you empower them. Coppola stole from the mob and the samurais, keep your friends close and your enemies closer.
Mm-hmm.
JFK said, forgive your enemy, but don't forget their name. And Fellini says, I need an enemy. So it's a lot of thoughts. The basic question is, how do you, Patrick, advise someone to deal with an enemy? But first, how would you respond to Alan Watts? If you acknowledge your enemy, you empower them.
Mm-hmm. Well, I don't know that I totally agree with that, but I think it's another point or premise that I take from Badiou is the notion that in politics there are always enemies. Okay, But, and that simply means that there's always an opposition. There's always something that you're struggling with. But for me, how to deal with an enemy, let me put it this way. I define the word forgiveness not as letting something go or giving it up, but as understanding.
Yeah.
Now, to understand an enemy does not mean that you erase the reality of what they've done. To give you an example, and this is sort of a ridiculous example, but it's one that comes to mind. Okay, is it how do I forgive Hitler? I can only forgive Hitler by understanding that something of Hitler is in me.
Yes.
This evil that motivated him, this cruelty, this need to kill the other, is in all of us. Now that doesn't mean, however, that it's okay. We don't need to teach people these horrible things that the Republicans are doing these days. That's just nonsense. We have to come to terms with it. And the one thing I disagree with that people do too frequently is they want to transfer evil elsewhere. So like the Germans were evil because they supported Hitler. Now there are people out there who want to go beat up a Russian, because of Putin. That evil is something we're all capable of. And if is this a time to recognize that? Because we see this, on the one hand, we see Putin over here, and then we see what's going on in our own country, where there are quite a number of people who may not know it, but they're Putinists in spirit.
Exactly.
But understanding also means being willing to communicate.
Yeah.
But not naively, because there are enemies you will not reach, who will kill you if they get a chance.
Yeah, Mark Twain said, forgiveness is the scent the flower gives off after the foot steps on it. To me, that scent is really well done.
That's beautiful. Yeah.
But he's saying understanding. And the flip is, and you get this because you're, to me, a pattern recognizer and you see the big picture. You're comprehensivist. Comprehensive awareness. And this is what I learned from studying McLuhan. He said, understanding is not having a point of view. So for you to say, there's a little Hitler in all of us, that's very much saying, I understand the big picture. In fact, Ram Dass said this enemy thing great. I think he says, I'm having a real hard time loving George Bush. It's like the same thing. It's like we're having a real hard time loving Trump or loving Putin or fill in the blank.
Mm-hmm.
What does hating do in the long run? So
can I give you an example real quick?
Please.
It's very personal. Okay. But I had to come to terms with my father, because I had a very problematic relationship with him. And he was a very messed up person in a lot of ways. He's a very cruel person, not physically, but more, mentally. And I finally realized that the only way I could forgive him was to understand him, to try and look at his life and the various elements that fed into it. And it wasn't that I put it all away and just forgot about it and moved on the way people tell you you're supposed to do, because I can't do that. The scars, that he left on me are there and they don't go away. But I do think I understand him. And in that sense, I do forgive him because, I can't say what I would have done had I had exactly the same experiences, and that really is what it boils down to. I don't, forgive Hitler in the sense of it's okay. Don't worry. But I think to understand him is to see historically as much as you can as to what created that possibility. And then take some responsibility.
Go ahead. Sorry.
No, that's okay. I think I've said it enough.
Well, you can take some responsibility. This is what I say is why weren't we taught conflict resolution growing up? And someone says, well, now they do teach conflict resolution, because I studied it at one point in my life and I learned conflict resolution is not you versus the other person. It's you and the other person versus the problem.
Yeah, that's a
You
good
know,
way of putting it. Yeah.
you team up and go, well, how can we, deal with this? So that's understanding. That's the big thing. So James Joyce was the first projectionist in Dublin over 100 years ago. He basically checked out. He said, this is stupid. Why should I go inside a building and see a movie of a tree when I can go outside and see a real tree? Years later, Faulkner said, sometimes the best fiction is more true than journalism. Why do we have to recreate things in order to get them? Why do we have to go to a theatrical play of people acting out life? Why don't we just live life?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a good point, I guess. But I'm one of those people that if it, when I see something, I immediately try to imagine it as an image, as a piece of film, as a photo, as something, So, and I don't know if you know this, but if you go to my blog, I've got a bunch of movies on there. And I'm getting ready to add a bunch more. I've got these really long ones that I haven't put on there yet. And I know that you're a filmmaker, and these are just sort of like stylized home movies, put it that way.
Yes. Yeah.
But there's no doubt about it. I would go to Europe or wherever, and I would just take pictures. And then I would go home and with my, relatively primitive editing program and just put these things together. And for me, that was part of the experience. It was again, it's a form of thought,
Yes.
And so I don't know. I mean, but there is something to be said for, occasionally, walking out and just looking at the world. I don't want to fault anybody for looking at it that way but it's just not the way all of us work. And I think we do see things in a different way when we see them captured in a certain way, context. It's like a montage in cinema, right? You put images with other images in a certain order, and you create a different perspective than you're going to get just walking down the street. That's all, and it gives you a different view.
Totally. Seeing new images with new eyes. So you sort of told me what attracted you and was the tipping point to pursue teaching, to pursue writing, intellectual history, being a scholar. But I want to dive right into this. A screenwriting teacher told me a great film, and just as this general great art, is when you can clearly see the intention of the maker. Kubrick says the opposite. Great film is when you can clearly not see the intention of the maker. What role does intention play in your creative process?
I would fall more in the Kubrick school, because for example, this poem I'm writing, this long poem, I was reading Dante, and I was reading an old translation of Dante. My Italian isn't really good enough to read Dante, but I suddenly realized that Dante created this form that allowed him to say anything about the world in which he lived, And so I got this idea for writing a poem, that it wouldn't be structured like Dante's in any way, but, and so I was thinking I wanted it to be a rhyming poem. And so I thought, well, should I try and do terza rima, this complex, And I thought, no way. There's no way I can do that. I mean, I will never. It's just too. So I decided to just do a much more loose, free form of rhyme, closer to hip hop, really, than to anything like Dante. And a lot of people were asking, why are you doing this rhyming? I mean, that must make it very difficult, and so forth. But actually, what I found was that it forces me to invent. It forces me to come up with formulations that don't automatically come to mind, because I have to use this limitation on myself.
Yeah.
And I discover things. So it turns out to be a mode of discovery. And I mean, I think a film where the intention is, let's put it this way, where it is narrowly fitted to one intention, one obvious intention, you know what I'm saying? because I don't think it's just a matter of having an intention. It's a matter of having a singular intention. Like you used the example of Sidney Lumet, and you take a movie like Prince of the City, which I think is his greatest film. You know, it's kind of like the Inferno.
Yeah.
Sidney Lumet's Inferno. And I mean, you could argue that he's certainly out to show, as he does in other films as well, you know, the nature of corruption. You know, the criminals, the police are all somehow mirror reflections of each other. But there's more to it than that. I mean, there's so much going on in that film. You know, and this is the beauty of cinema, is that a single image has so many facets to it, so many different ways of looking at it, that you can't even control the possibilities of interpretation, understanding, reaction, feeling, so forth and so on. And the fact that Kubrick would understand that doesn't surprise me at all, because I think, you know, one could argue that in a way his films are very formally structured. You know, I just mean by that there's a consciousness about form in his film. But at the same time, it's almost like, you know, he's creating a box in which he puts infinity, so to speak. You know, it's like, because if you didn't, you just sort of have a diffuse chaos that he couldn't, you know, no one could relate to. Anyway,
That was good. It really evoked one of my heroes is Lord Buckley, the jazz shaman, and his two words are my mantra: dig infinity.
that's
Like,
good.
yeah, getting in Kubrick's box of infinity. So this is like another question about tools, and just really brief. You know, Jean Rouch, the French documentarian and film theorist, says, if I put a camera between me and you, it's more true than if there's no camera. McLuhan says the most human technology about us, he says the most human thing about us is technology. And so then New York Times this past Sunday, Ocean Vuong, this poet, was talking about reading. And you're a text guy. You've written books. You're writing poetry. And he said, through the linear dependability of the sentence, I know exactly where I am, where I'm standing. I'm more myself reading than I am myself.
Wait, I'm more what?
So,
reading?
you know, I'm more myself when I'm reading than I am myself. You know, he's just saying, you know, that he's more himself reading than he is himself. And you know, I thought that was a powerful statement.
Yeah,
but it's this idea that McLuhan says everything we invent extends some humanness. So knife and fork extends our teeth. The shutter in a camera or a projector is an extension of our eyelid. You know, philosophy or religion might be an extension of consciousness. It doesn't have to be tangible. What does the moving image camera, whether it's film or video, extend for you? What humanness is extended with that tool, the moving image camera?
I don't know if I can think of it quite in those terms. I mean, I really like what you were saying, particularly the reference to McLuhan, because the one thing I don't agree with today is this kind of anti-technology. I would almost call it a fantasy, because
it's totally
because we have this gift, you know, that's been given to us, and there's so much you can do with it. That I don't, but obviously, like any gift, like the printing press, it has negative consequences as well. I mean, that's just the nature of the beast. I like the idea of I'm more myself when I'm reading, and I think in general, I'm more on myself when I'm not in myself. In some ways. So when you're reading or when you're watching a movie, you kind of go out of yourself. You know, and because when you're in yourself, it's kind of like you can't see yourself from the outside. You can't see your own experiences, and to me, that's what makes art and really all philosophy so important. You know, because not that everyone has to do or read exactly the same thing, but that there are ways of going out of yourself to recognize what you are, or really better yet, what you're becoming. Because I think that's what we are. We're almost becoming.
Really good. See, this is where I say you don't have to answer the question.
Mm-hmm.
It gets you out of yourself. So it's really what humanness does it extend is transformation, revelation. These are human things. But it's funny, I just got to tell you, because most people or a lot of people will say, what does the movie camera extend? Is sight, vision, eye. And McLuhan said, no, it extends your foot because you're traveling. Which I always say, it's like we're on a magic carpet ride when we're in the movies, and it is fun. So I talked to Michael Apted 40 years ago, and I said, why do rock video editors feel so obliged to edit fast? Most people don't know, Abel Gance invented rapid montage in 1922, but it really flourished in the 80s with MTV to the point where Marty Scorsese said, I cut my films faster because of MTV.
Yeah.
So when I asked Michael Apted this question, why do these rock video editors feel so obliged to edit fast? He said, because we can take in information faster. So I asked this question with a bias. Can we literally learn to take in information faster, or we just brainwashed to believe we can?
That's it. Boy, you really come up with some interesting questions. Yeah. I mean, obviously, the video revolution, the music video revolution changed cinema in a lot of ways. And Scorsese is one of the most positive examples, because I described, particularly when he made Goodfellas, and he suddenly, was like on adrenaline. And then when he did Casino, it was like, overpowered, I think we can take things. I don't know that we take in things faster. I just think that it's a different kind of emotional discourse, if that makes any sense. I mean, to me, Scorsese really is the best example, because a lot of people try to do that, and all they create is kind of confusion. Sometimes it's fun confusion, like heavy beat, rap music or hip hop or something like that. You're enjoying it, but it's not really conveying. Whereas Scorsese manages to do that, and you may not exactly walk out of there thinking you knew exactly what happened, but you get something out of it. There's a power to it. He has artistic force, and so he made it work. And but all the directors have been influenced that way. But at the same time, I don't think that's the only way to do it. I mean, and there are, people have made slow movies. I once had this dream, like about 30 years ago or 40 years ago, I guess, when I was a graduate student at Santa Cruz. And I had this dream of a boring film festival, because all of my favorite films were pretty boring. like 2001, Barry Lyndon, really long films. And I love long films. I really do. I'm probably one of the few people that's watched Show 2 or 3 times. But it's not only a very important film, but it's really amazing cinema, So it can be slow and be very powerful. And Scorsese can do a slow film if he wants to. I mean, I would say that what was Kubrick's last movie again? Eyes Wide Shut. That was pretty slow movement. It was classical Kubrick, but it was still. Kubrick is one of the masters of using music and image. So it's not just one thing. It's important.
And then you got Bellatar, and you got Tarkovsky, and so it's an endless variation. So that was good. So what do you think, Patrick, was the motive of the cave artist? Not necessarily what Herzog said in his film or anthropologists have proposed. What's your hunch was the motive of the cave artist?
I don't know. I really don't know. I think that there's a need. I think part of it is, you were asking earlier, do I think we have an impulse, a drive towards these kinds of
Yeah.
things? And I think what we see there is this need to preserve, this desire to preserve that, you see something and you want people to know that you saw it, that it was a part of your world. And I think that moves art generally. I mean, we're all writing for the future,
Yeah.
in some ways. I mean, particularly like now when you make a movie, if you made a movie in 1905, you probably didn't know what you were doing. You were just trying to figure out what this was. But when you make a movie now, you're thinking about, because you've seen movies that were made 40 or 50 years ago, and especially now because the preserving is much better. We're getting more and more quality. Old films are appearing in much more quality forms than they used to. And, it's this idea of communicating. It's like I sometimes call cinema a time machine because we go
Yeah.
backwards and we go forwards in it, and
Yep.
so that's how I would say it. But truthfully speaking, ultimately, I don't know what they
No,
were.
that's beautiful. And that's what it's important to me when people feel, I'm not trying to put you on the spot. If
Mhm.
saying I don't know, or a pass, or I don't like when people say pass so much, but saying I don't know is a total valid answer. But you did suss out this whole thing, and since I read a little of your writings on cinema, I wanted to follow up with this one. Harry Smith via Bruno said we invented cinema to fall asleep. And, and this is very interesting because Yoko Ono says that when you dream a dream alone, it's a dream. But if you dream a dream with other people, it's reality. And, we sit in a movie theater with a lot of people, and it's like we're all dreaming the dream together. And then one of your articles ended with this great quote. I loved it. And you said, either none of us is dreaming, or as Alice says, we're all part of the same dream.
Mhm.
So, what role has dreams played in your creative process?
Well, this poem I'm writing actually at this point is in a way a dream poem, although I don't exactly call it that, because it's the framework is a kind of fantasy, but what drives the poem is dialogue, between dialogues with the dead would be one way to put it. I don't know. I mean, I think that I think cinema is a kind of dreaming. You have that old Spanish play, Life is a Dream. Um,
Yeah.
and in my poem, I have a line that life is a movie. I'm actually having a conversation with Oscar Wilde, and he comes up with an idea about a movie that's actually my idea about a movie. It's like this notion that, this fantasy that Billy the Kid really didn't die and he lived to be about 100 and he experienced, the 20th century. And I think that dreaming, there's two kinds of dreams. There, dreams that are, I'm leaving out what actually happens at night, okay, for the moment.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right.
There are dreams in which we simply fantasize, about pretty much anything. It can be nightmares or they can be happy or whatever. And then there are different dreams where we take something, some possibility that we recognize in the physical material condition of human beings, and we make up our minds to take steps in that direction, and we build. This is, for me, is a very Blakean idea. The idea that the imagination is concrete. And to me, that concrete imagination is what is most important about art, because even a fantasy, like take the movies. I mean, you'll probably get the idea that my taste in cinema is pretty wide ranging, but I love the Lord of the Rings trilogy movie, and I like the book too, but I love the movie, and And I remember reading that Tolkien said at one point that no, I wasn't thinking about World War II or any of that stuff. I was just making this up. And I thought to myself, yeah, I don't really care. You weren't thinking about it whether you knew it or not. Because,
exactly. Yeah.
And there's a story that obviously nothing in it is real,
Yeah.
in our everyday sense. But God, does it speak to our reality?
Yeah.
It dissects it. It takes it apart. It explores every confusing element. I mean, down to the point, where, the way in which in the struggle to achieve a better world, we can become evil ourselves, and God knows if we learned anything in the 20th century, we learned that. So, I think dreaming.
That was really good, because when I say, when an artist creates their art, it's no longer theirs. That's the user. This is McLuhan mid-career. He updated. Most people don't know this. McLuhan rebooted his most famous aphorism, "Meaning is a message," mid-career, to "the user is the content." And his main teacher was Finnegan's Wake by James Joyce. That's where McLuhan got everything, pretty much. And he says, if you don't understand Joyce, you can't understand me. And he said, this is what Joyce was saying: all you Finnegans, wake up. That everybody uses their powers, like you said, they're separate. This dreaming at night, we use these creative powers, but artists actually dream while they're awake, dreaming awake. And not to be elitist, but I'm curious. T.S. Eliot said that poetry is outing your inner dialogue. What language is your inner dialogue in?
Okay, what do you mean by language?
Very good. Patrick, you win. You answered a question with a question. That's what the Irish do. The Irish go, hey, I hear you Irish answer a question with a question. They go, okay. No, yeah, again, it's like usually it's the follow-up is, what form is your inner consciousness in? Because people sometimes go English, and I go, well, what form is your inner consciousness in? So yeah, language is more than just words from a particular, like in English language.
Like, I'm gonna displace your question a little bit, but
good.
I can relate this a bit to Finnegan's Wake, because Finnegan's Wake is a book that teaches you what literature is, in a sense, because it is the most extreme example. And what I'm going to say is, sometimes my students would say, what do you understand about Finnegan's Wake? And I would say, exactly what I wrote. If I haven't written it, I didn't understand that. Because to read Finnegan's Wake is to write about Finnegan's Wake is to enter in the process of trying to understand or draw something out of it that is incomplete, that only captures a tiny facet of this complex thing. And so for me, what was it? The language in which I what? What was the original question again? The language in which
poetry is outing your inner dialogue. What language is your inner dialogue in?
Well, my inner dialogue is obviously in English, but it's also in images.
Yeah.
The way I would put it. And there's a cinema. Cinema is, for me, it's been the passion of my life. I love writing because that's what I can do. But the reason why I made these crazy little films, is because I love cinema so much that I had to find some way just to play with it myself,
Well, you're more a pure artist, because you go, you're like Charles Ives. Like, I can make my money, my career being a scholar and an educator, but then I can go make my films and I don't have to answer to no producer. Like, you've got to create product here, boy. You got to get like, Billy Wilder's great quote. He says, I'm just hoping that they'll like my movie as much as the popcorn. Because he knew they don't make any money off the movie. They make the money off the popcorn. You know,
Yeah, I think
pretty
he
good.
was being very modest, though. 'Cause
Yeah,
some
he was being modest. But his other there are so many great Billy Wilders. The other one is make the subtleties obvious.
Mhm.
But no, you got it. And I have to follow up. What is the function of poetry?
Oh boy. Um, I mean, this is just going to be a very personal view,
Yeah,
because I don't have any philosophy of, there's a unique essence to poetry. Um, I mean, for me, what poetry enables you, gives you, an, a way of getting into thought that isn't simply an abstract line of reasoning. That
yeah,
you can you can and you can explore the unconscious, your own
yeah,
unconscious. You know, and poetry enables you to do that. I mean, I think. Like for me, I don't have a particular gift for imagery or, um, my bent is frankly philosophical, and that's what comes through in the poetry that I write. I've written a few lyrical poems over the years. I don't mean lyrical, like I just mean short poems.
yeah.
I don't mean anything special there, and they were always written on occasions. They were always about something that happened to me that day or that week or whatever. Um, But this long poem is more like, I'm trying to say something that I couldn't say in critical discourse, and I think poetry just gives you a different relation to language, than the one that we normally have, because the words take on a certain autonomy. I don't agree with Mallarmé that we make poetry with words and not thoughts, but I do agree with Mallarmé because for me, words are thoughts. And so when you're trying to find a special relation to words and you're paying attention to rhythm and sound, and I don't write, songs, but every line I write, I'm counting syllables and I'm counting stresses, and sometimes I'm stretching it in really extreme ways, but it all plays into a different relation to thought,
Yeah.
and so you can say things that you didn't even know you knew, um, and discover
That's
things that
really,
maybe you didn't know.
yeah, that's really good. But repeat what you said. Mallarmé says what?
Oh,
Not
Mallarmé said one time, somebody asked him, "How do you get the thoughts for your poems?" And he said, "Madam, I do not write poems with thoughts. I write them with words."
oh,
And
how do you get the
ideas or thoughts for your poems.
ideas or thoughts for your poems? That's good because here you must have ESP because you anticipated the next question.
Hmm.
And I often use this because Mallarmé is huge in the whole McLuhan symbolist Finnegan's Wake
Hmm.
world.
Yeah.
He says, don't paint the thing itself, paint the effect it produces,
Hmm.
which is, Poe inventing the detective novel, effects precede causes, reasoning backwards. And it's like, I'm just going to create the effect. Doesn't matter what the content is. That's why we got all the stupid rock poets like Jim Morrison, Bob Dylan, Patti Smith, and Kurt Cobain. It's like they're all symbolist wannabes. Like it doesn't
Hmm.
matter what I say. It's just, but
Yeah.
this is I'm slowly getting to the question because these two um quotes about the function of poetry, I think you'll get a kick out of. Gary Snyder said, my task as a poet entails the work of seeing the world without language, then bringing that seeing into
Hmm.
language.
Hmm.
And that's sweet and nice. Then Rex Roth said, the purpose of poetry is to woo your lover and subvert the bourgeois.
I
That's
kind of
like
like that one.
that's like a practical, like love poems will do it. And subvert the bourgeois. That's us lefties. We love that. Okay, so but here's Louis Bersani, who just died. His
Hmm.
Mallarmé study said the very crises which threatens the writing of poetry sustains poetic composition. And I thought, of all people, you could give me an idea. What do you think he meant? Because he's studying Mallarmé, and he says the very crisis which threatens the writing of poetry sustains poetic composition.
Well, I can only speculate, but I think what he's getting at is, I mean, the crisis of writing poetry, I believe, by the way, it's a perennial crisis, at least since the 19th century, is that as the world has become engulfed in various forms of mass media, beginning with newspapers and so forth and so on, and also, ironically, as literacy has become more widespread, the crisis is that we feel we sense that we've lost the conventions that once made poetry, generated poetry, I guess I should say. And so that someone like Mallarmé went to the ultimate extreme of, he was sort of the first language poet in a lot of ways, because in many ways his poems are about the language itself, and that's an example of how it starts generating new things. Is that in the 20th century, school after school after school is generated out of this inability to sustain convention. Poetry is no longer conventional. Some people are going to look at my poem and say, wait, this is so conventional. It's like 3-line stanzas, rhyme and so forth and so on. But even that is something that's coming after so much has happened that, you can go back and pick up something old and make it new in a certain way. I'm not saying I've succeeded. I don't know if I've succeeded or not, but
yeah,
that's how I would put it, is that we keep generating new ideas. And I would also add to that, though, that rock and roll, blues, rock and roll, that whole revolution in music and lyrics has really, I read something, what was it? I can't think of who it was. I think it was Bono. I just read something the other day, and Bono was saying something to the effect that he said rock and roll poetry, and he said it's greater than, or it's bigger than poetry, or something like that. And he used the example of the line from the Beatles' early song, I saw her standing there, because it sounds so plain and utterly unpoetic, but in the context of the poem, it's perfect, And I think that, and with the emergence of hip hop, along with rock and roll and blues and so forth and so on, it's given new energies, different kinds of energies to poetry. And some of it has to do with how to use ordinary language, how to use, different classes of language, if that makes any sense.
No, that was beautiful. Let me tell you, Patrick, I've been asking that question to poets for so many years.
Uh-huh.
No one's really sussed it out as well as you. And it was funny because you brought up Mallarmé before I did. And it was like the timing was perfect. But the two things you evoked with teaching me all that was, I got a chunk of notes here that I can meditate on. This, first of all, they asked Bob Dylan years ago, are you a poet? And he goes, no, I'm a trapeze artist. That is a great out. But McLuhan really nailed it. And I don't know if it resonates with you, but what you were saying, especially when you said mass media, is he said, you can't write the great American novel anymore because the front page of the newspaper is the great American novel, or whatever. Like when I open up AOL, look at my email, I've got to look at 4 new items of hot news. Mm-hmm. So it is like, that's more important than the email, than anything to read that has content. It is like, woo, now I know there's a slap or something. But, this question is similar, and it's two of my film heroes. George Manupelli started the Ann Arbor Film Festival 60 years ago. It's half the amount of the medium's, only 130 years old. Mm-hmm. His festival, just experimental film. His mantra is ignore yourself. Jonas Mekas says there is no self-expression. And I love when highbrow literati like you has an appreciation for blues and jazz.
I'm not very knowledgeable of jazz, really. I think jazz is very complex.
Right.
I'm not
Right. But I mean,
musically trained, but go ahead.
right. But I'm just saying, you don't discount this, rock and roll and blues is this and
No,
literature is
not
that.
at all.
It's like this whole big soup. But Cecil Taylor, the great avant-garde jazz pianist, says, I'm just a vehicle and this just comes through me. So again, it's a stupid question and it's both, but is art making, meaning literature, painting, every filmmaking, is art making more self-expression or more you're a vehicle for whatever technology, culture, the environment?
Mm-hmm. Okay, that one I actually understand, I think. The thing is that it is self-expression, but the self isn't what we tend to think it is.
Yeah.
Self is not this sort of, point of identity somewhere located in our pituitary gland or something. We are others. What was it that Rimbaud wrote? I am other. J'ai, he said, I is other. J'ai l'autre. I is the other, And so I think that, when we, like, I imagine, see, for me, teaching and writing for me was always improvisation. I used to make outlines when I would walk into a classroom, and I never followed them. Never.
Yeah.
I mean, I just had them there because I needed a security blanket because I just went blank,
Yeah.
And when I write, it's the same thing. Sometimes I'll have like a rough conception of where I might be going, but it really changes from movement to movement. And so I think that there's self-expression, because how can you not express yourself? I mean, it's like, things that come out of you are self-expressions of a sort, but how you understand the notion of self can be quite different, because I'm also kind of a Lacanian. I don't know if you know the work of Lacan, but
yes, go ahead. Yeah.
And for me, the subject is embedded in other forms of subjectivity. There's no sort of pure, absolute, isolated subject, and that's something that we give up when we enter language. Period. That we're not completely ourselves. We don't completely belong to ourselves, and so, and again, getting back to poetry, that is part of what poetry exploits. More than all literature does, but more, in a more explicit way because of its unique relation to language itself. Because all poetry, in a way, is language poetry. I mean, it's
exactly
even Byron.
So, the hidden question, Patrick, is: can art making be egoless?
Can our what?
Can art making be egoless?
I guess I would say probably not, but I think that is the function to some extent of form, that we erase ourselves, not, the term I really like is the term that William Blake uses, frankly, self-annihilation.
Wow.
I think art at its best is a form of self-annihilation, but that is also a form of transformation. You know what I mean? It isn't simply that the self is being killed, but rather that it is being transformed through the very act of creation. And it's also within Blake, and I think this is very critical for me. It's also fundamental to political existence. Okay. If we can't, let me put it to you, this is going to relate back to stuff we talked about earlier, but in any kind of debate, any kind of dialogue, where you're trying to accomplish something, you have to have what Blake would call mutual forgiveness. And what I mean is, if you can't tolerate someone not being exactly on the same wavelength as yourself, you know, then a dialogue becomes impossible and
Yeah.
compromise becomes impossible. But
Yeah.
without compromise, nothing ever gets done.
Yeah.
Because no two human beings ever see anything exactly in the same way.
Yeah.
In spite of the fact that underlying everyone's vision is the vision of others, you know. So
Yeah.
I don't know if I answered your
No,
question.
you did. And guess what? The first question I started with 40 years ago,
Hmm.
my most important question, I skipped. And now you just answered it in a way. And it is, well, it's a stupid question, but it's fun. What's more important, conviction or compromise?
Oh, well, I would say they're both important because
Yeah.
conviction, the only way we sustain ourselves, you know, like if you're committed to, I guess, for lack of a better word, I'm going to say cause, but I actually think of it as more complex than that. Um, you have to sustain conviction in order to keep going. Kind of
Yeah.
like keeping going is got to be the key. You have to
Yeah.
keep going, you know. But compromise is fundamental to the thought process itself because, you know, unless you believe that truth is this kind of like this fixed proposition, you
Yeah.
know, that everyone's got to agree to or they're all wrong. Everyone who disagrees with it is wrong. Then it's impossible to engage in a real truth process because you're never going to find one single proposition that everyone is going to completely agree to or not find some problem with. You know, every time you legally, for example, every time you legally define freedom, you end up with unforeseen consequences. That
Yeah.
freedom defined this way turns out to be bad for this group or that group or whatever. And there has to be a continual process. So, you know, conviction is what keeps you going, and compromise is also what keeps the process going. Um,
Yeah.
and you have to
That
be
was
willing to
good.
see beyond
Yeah.
yourself. And in that sense, it's egoless, if you will. I mean,
Yeah.
in the sense that you
Yeah.
recognize that your ego isn't the end of it, the end of the process.
Yeah. No, everybody was saying, oh, no, art making it can't be egoless. And then finally, one person said, great art is egoless. And I went, holy moly. But it was funny because I got to tell you, it took 25 years asking that question, what's more important, conviction or compromise, before a guy said, depends on what you mean by important. But I'll tell you, this has been very important. And I usually at the 90-minute point say, hey, I asked for 90 minutes and we go over. So I have to beg of you, can you go a little longer, or are you on a time schedule?
We can go over. I probably should stop around at least by 3, because that
Oh,
leaves somewhere
wow.
at 4.
That's amazing. Another 30 minutes, I'll milk it, dude. But this is amazing because I wanted to lead right into this question. Um, and it's a little out of order, but it is, you create what you resist. And I'm not saying you, Patrick, but
Yeah.
there's a saying that goes, one creates what one resists. What you resist persists is another way. And Bob Goldthwait, the comedian, says, you are what you hate. And James Joyce really nailed it. He says, it's a curious thing how your mind is super saturated with the religion in which you say you disbelieve. But but Louis Buñuel, I guess, went to the top of the hill with this one. Thank God I'm an atheist. So I'm going to blend it with a bunch more because, well, maybe we should just go into that. And then what's your take, Patrick, on this line? You create what you resist. Not you, Patrick, but one creates what one resists. What's your general feeling on that?
Well, it sort of makes sense to me, although I would, excuse me, I would say the creation is a kind of resistance to some extent. I mean,
Yeah.
because, you know, nobody is thinking all the time. I mean, we all have little conformities that make our life comfortable. Things that we don't question, don't worry about too much. Like you know, what we eat, how we sleep, so forth and so on. Um, whenever you try to create something that isn't just a repetition of what we already know, you're obviously resisting. Um, there's a simple word I'm looking for, and it's just escaping me. Inertia, the inertia of everyday existence. Um, and I do think all art does that to one extent or another, even the most popular art. Um, it's it may seem like it's because it's popular. It may seem like it's inherently conformist or something, but in
Yeah.
reality, it always projects into different directions. I do think that, for example, in the music world today, there is a good bit of conformity. Um, and so when someone does something really different, um, it probably takes a great deal of effort, because it's it's gotten to be something about money, making a lot of money. Of course, it always was that. But
Yeah.
the Beatles or the Stones didn't set out really to get rich. I don't think, but they got rich, and
Yeah.
and that. Whereas today, I think a lot of people set out simply to get rich to start with, um,
Yeah.
and but those things are very hard to decide because you may think, I mean, after all, Scorsese makes money off his movies, and
Yeah.
they're still great movies as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah. Frank Zappa said, in order to be in the music business, you have to sell your cock and your balls. And, he also said, hey, I'm a devout capitalist. So, he's one of the examples of someone who's most people think of the most unsold out, stuck to his grounds because it didn't matter. He just made music that he wanted to and was able to somehow make a living doing it.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a few people that do that, but he knew that if he hit this note or sang this lyric, kids would buy his records at the same time. So it was interesting what you were saying there. I appreciated that. But I was curious, what is the function of laughter?
Of what?
Laughter, laughing.
Survival.
Oh, nice.
I mean,
Okay.
it's funny because I was writing something the other day. I can't think of what it was now, but and I made the point that like we watch a play like Waiting for Godot, and we laugh, even though it's possible to look at that play and get very depressed. I mean, if you want, but the
Yes.
laughter is what makes us and sustains us. It's what enables us to keep going. I mean,
Yeah.
it's a cliche, but I think I've always believed that you have to have a sense of humor about yourself because otherwise you go mad.
Yeah, it's like turning it. That's what McLuhan's book is called, From Cliche to Archetype. And
Mhm.
look at what Joyce did. He took the word laughter, added two letters, the A and the S, and turned it into laugh tears. You laugh and you cry.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
I'm slowly getting to this. What Gurdjieff said was laughter is the reconciliation of yes and no. And I thought that was amazing because there were two quotes that you put in one of your essays that to me just evokes that Gurdjieff. James Joyce, there's no reconciliation without the recognition of sundry.
yes, yeah.
And then the Blake, no true friendship without opposition.
That's true. Yeah, I mean,
So does that resonate with that you are what you hate? Are Joyce and Blake both saying that pretty much in a way with those two quotes, or do you want to
yeah,
suss
I
that
think
out a
so. I
little?
mean, I think Joyce. I mean, Blake definitely. That is actually, I
Yeah,
think, critical to Blake's thinking. I think with Joyce, I mean, Joyce was not. He was a difficult person in some ways, but um, I think even when he did things that were kind kind of low down, because I mean, he put people in Ulysses, real people, who
Right.
he painted in a really, shall we say, light that they wouldn't like to be seen as. The guy who was I forget his name now, but the guy that Buck Mulligan was based on,
Yeah.
and who was an important person within the Irish Free State Republic and so forth. He didn't like the way Joyce put him in that book, but I don't think Joyce's purpose was to humiliate him or anything like that. In fact, I even think there was an element of love in it. It was that these people were critical to his formation. They were part of him, and that's. See, in my poem, I'm doing it more literally than Joyce. It's sort of like everybody's in my head, even people I hate, like Stalin and Mao, and because to me, people like that. Forgive me, I'm going to say this. Is that the word communism is important to me.
Yeah.
It's impossible to use it because Stalin and Mao and others.
Yeah.
Ruined the significance of the word, and betrayed it completely. I have this line in my poem where Stalin is talking to a man who goes unnamed, but he resembles a certain politician still with us.
Yeah.
And he says, but he's looking at Hitler and he says, "Hell, I killed more communists than you did." This is Stalin to Hitler. And I mean, I think he probably did, as a matter of fact. And somehow I think I've gotten off track there, but
no, that was beautiful, because it reminded me of one of my heroes is Paul Krasner, the political comedian.
Mm-hmm.
And one of his greatest products was a bumper sticker that said "Fuck communism." So Lewis Carroll, I believe, as many as 6 impossible things before breakfast. Have you believed in any impossible things lately?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I write about this. I said, we have to believe in the impossible, period.
Yeah.
I think that the impossible is, an end to the mess we're in. I mean, look, it's like this. You look at the world and you know how most people see it. And you know that they think X, Y, and Z are impossible. So why talk about it?
Yeah.
Okay. But until you commit yourself to the impossible, it will never become possible.
Yeah.
And that's always the starting point. I even get that, to me, it's like, that's what, writers like as strange as Beckett, who may seem completely unpolitical. But even there, I mean, it's all about, confronting the impossible.
Yeah.
With, and refusing to accept it as impossible, but recognizing that for all practical purposes at the moment, it is impossible. I mean, like, it's sort of like the idea of real democracy.
Yeah.
A friend of mine, a colleague I had at Louisiana State University, had this line. And he said, people ask me what I think of democracy, and I tell them I think it would be a great idea.
Yeah.
It'd be nice to see some. Like, has there ever really been a true democracy? And I don't think any existing democracy today is perfect. And probably the idea of a perfect democracy is impossible. But why give up on it?
Beautiful. But you have you have that drive to keep trying, and I like that. But Dick Gregory said, "Why do we try to force democracy on other countries? It doesn't even work here."
That's a different thought, though. That's
that is a different thought. But I will supply a Sun Ra quote that favors your point of view. I think he says, "The impossible attracts me because everything possible has been done and the world didn't change."
That's true.
So, Patrick, tell me one element of your, you've been a creative force in many ways, writing books, scholar, educator, in your own poetry. One major element and all that's changed, and one major element that stayed the same?
One major element that's changed and what has stayed the same. Well, I've changed. When I was about 18 or 19 years, you asked me earlier about leaving the church or something
Yeah.
along those lines. I did that when I was about 17 or 18. At least in my head, I did it.
Yeah.
And I was about 19 or 20 when I began reading Marx and other. I didn't really read the serious stuff. I read the easy stuff. You just disappeared from the screen, by the way. Okay, there you are. I went through a lot of different phases. I mean, I was in SDS and I was in, some local things in Memphis. And then I went to New York and I was in this group called the Spartacus League, which was a kind of Trotskyite organization. And then I went on, I got out of it all. I got to where I couldn't take it. Actually, I was reading Ulysses and I got called on the carpet for reading a bourgeois writer or something. That was it for me. But what has altered is that over time, I've come to have a much more complex view of the nature of revolution. I don't believe in violent revolution because I don't believe it ever leads to anything except another violent state. I'm a proponent of a kind of communism, but I don't see the goal of communism as seizing the state, because the state is always, no matter what, going to be a problem. It will be necessary, in my view, to some extent, but it will be a problem. It will always be a conflict between the multitude or the masses of people and the state, So for me, what communism is about is empowerment. And yes, there are certain things like I'm not against some degree of social ownership. We already have social ownership. I mean, we have, the military is a socialist institution, so forth and so on. But that's changed radically over time. But at the same time, I've never once I moved in that direction, and what ultimately drove me in that direction was my childhood and my relationship to my father. Because my father was a blue-collar worker. He was a union painter. He certainly wasn't as bad off as, the people who suffer the most in this country. I mean, we always had food. There was never any hunger in our family. But, I knew that world. I knew those people, and I knew how that they had so little self-esteem, and that more than anything drove me to the left, because I knew that that as long as this is the case, and this kind of suffering, it's going to generate other problems as well. And growing up in Memphis, of course, it was racism. My father was a racist, like most blue-collar workers in that day and age, particularly in the South. And so, that for me, that political drive, and something my mother said to me, my mother was freaking out when I was about 20 or 21 years old one time. And she knew I was involved with these organizations. And she said, I'm going to call the FBI on you, because she thought I was ruining my life, And she meant well, but she got over that. And some years later, I was in graduate school in California. And she said, I just want you to know something. I know that everyone thinks that you've changed and that you no longer have these ideas, but I know that you have them just as much now as you did then. You're just changing your approach to it. And I thought that was very insightful, because I totally agreed with her. I don't feel like I've ever given that up, but I have totally changed in the way I would approach it and the way I even begin to understand it. You're kind of going in and out of the image there.
Well, no, that's just the server. I'm still here, but that is heavy. Your mom's intuition. She knew that was beautiful recollection there. Beautiful. And so Utah Phillips says anarchy is making rules for yourself and not other people. Who's entitled to make the rules?
Wait, who said that?
Utah Phillips. I mean, it's not really true. A great anarchist told me that's not really true, but it sounds good. Utah Phillips is a great political folk singer.
Oh, I got you. I got you now.
Yeah, and he said anarchy is making rules for yourself and other people. I mean, it's an interesting little tidbit, but it's basically the question is who's entitled to make the rules?
Well, I mean, the thing is, that's where you get back to the question of democracy. I mean, I don't think that we can live as if other people don't exist.
Yeah.
I just don't buy that. And so the question is, how do we arrive at some kind of rules or of engagement with one another? And it's the big problem. And right now we're just terribly aware of it because of this idiocy over COVID and so forth and so on. And these peculiar way of understanding freedom is my freedom is the right to screw other people or whatever. Of course, that was always a problem. That's always been a problem within our culture. I just, I think ultimately, Spinoza's had two ideas that were really had a huge impact on me. One of them was that he believed in democracy in the 17th century. He believed that democracy would be the best form of government, but there really was no democracy around. But he had two concepts of democracy. One of them was the simple political concept, i.e., democracy is ruled by the majority, something like that. The other concept was ontological, not strictly simply political, but ontological. And his ontological argument was that all power emanates from the multitude.
Yeah.
And, he used Latin. And so he used, for the power of the multitude, he used the word potentia, which we associate with potential,
Yeah.
And for the power of the state or of a ruler, he used the word potestas, which is more strictly power as centralized governance, But, I don't think we're going to ever achieve utopia. I just think we have to continue an ongoing process. But whatever we can do to allow for a true democracy, a real engagement that allows us to, operate through some degree of consensus. I guess, like, for example, for me, the nature of revolution, a real revolution, can't be force. It has to be argument. It has to be convincing someone of something. And that's very hard to do. I mean, how do you convince, what is it? How many people are in this country now? 600 million, I think, something like that. How do you convince 600 million people, that they would all be better off if we had something that they would call socialized medicine, that we had how do you convince them, that there are things that probably should be private and driven by some degree of profit motive, but other things that probably shouldn't be, although we have institutions that are not really driven by profit motive. It's not easy. And so it's easy to resort to violence. Like, okay, you're bourgeois and you're not, so I'm going to kill you, but you're okay. I mean, which of course is nonsense. I mean, it just leads to violence. So I don't know. I'm kind of rambling on here.
No,
so,
it's good. Look at all your ramblings been great, Patrick. And it goes back to the enemy question. I left out American Indians, indigenous, say your enemy's your best teacher.
Mm-hmm.
So, it is argument is the real revolution, not force. I totally agree with you. So Moshe Feldenkrais works with healing and movement. He says it's literally possible to identify a weakness and incorporate it to become a strength, rather than we're normally taught to overcome a weakness. Tell me a weakness you turned into a strength.
Well, I feel like I'm going to be going back to some of the same stuff, but I gave you some bits of information about my family and my father and so forth and so on. So, you already know something. So let's just say that I had an incredible inferiority complex when I was, say, 20 years old or so. And my father spent my entire childhood telling me that I would be nothing, And
Yeah.
he pretty well at some point had me more or less convinced. But at the same time, well, I'm going to have to tell the story very briefly. Okay,
Go ahead.
my mother had her first major psychotic episode when I was 14 years old, and it was a it was a shock to me. I mean, I didn't see it coming, and I didn't know what was happening. She was deluded, hallucinating. It was crazy. And my father came home from work and sort of walked into this chaotic situation and dragged me back to the bedroom and said, "This is all your fault."
Wow. Oh my.
And the thing is, something in me snapped at that point. And it was sort of like up to that time, I think I wanted my father to love me and I wanted to please him, but I didn't seem to do a very good job of it. And I adored my mother, but suddenly my mother had vanished into this illness and my father was my enemy. And so it was like from that point forward, I just began to compensate. I was going to prove to myself more than to him that I was not nothing. And and at first this was a challenge because I really didn't have much to work with. But over time, I just kept going further and further. And like I mentioned, that professor,
Yeah.
the fact that he, when I met him, he just gave me a sense of myself that I'd never had before, and it completely altered my perception. And later, I sometimes attribute a lot of good things that came out of my life to the various people I fell in love with during my 20s, because, I've never loved a woman who I learned to hate, no matter what happened, no matter whether they dumped me or, or whatever. I mean, it's just everyone I've loved, I still love, maybe not in the same way, but so that happened. And then when I met the woman I married, at this point, I was in graduate school in Memphis, trying to go to graduate school somewhere else. And I remember one time I was writing a paper or something, and I said, "I don't think I can do this, and this sucks." And she said, "You couldn't write anything that sucks, even if you wanted to." And that was it was a very small thing, but it really aided me. So what I'm saying is, over time, I turned this feeling of inadequacy into a driving force. Now, sometimes I have to say this driving force is not altogether a good thing. I mean, it made me kind of neurotic. I wasn't always, at the same time that I wanted to prove something, I also was sort of at war with the system, if you understand what I mean. I didn't write what they wanted me to write. I didn't tend to write the proper critical perspective, that would be, popular with the mainstream of academia or whatever. But still, that was something that became a kind of strength, and it certainly built up my confidence over the years. So I just eventually started believing in myself, and even to the point where I could kind of forgive my father and let it go, but not let it go in the sense of forget, just let it go in the sense of, I understand you now.
Yeah. No, your word understanding really resonates with me a lot, Patrick. And again, I appreciate how honest and articulate you are. Just a few more here and we're out of here. Anger can be a productive emotion when fill in the blank.
Well, when it's the first step towards critical consciousness.
Yeah. How do you find
what?
No, that's fine. How do you find peace of mind?
Peace of mind. I can only say through work.
Beautiful. Now, this question's interesting because you just explained this phenomenon that happened to you at 14. Mm-hmm. The question is, if you were walking down the street today and you met yourself as a 12-year-old, what would you say to your 12-year-old self?
Um, that's a really good question. What would I say to him? Don't think that you know what's going on, because you don't, and you're not as bad as you think you are, and um, but you're not as lost as you think you are either.
Oh,
Just keep
wow.
trying. I mean, I don't know. I don't think that's very original, but I can't.
No, that's really good, because I'll tell you, when I tear up or the person I'm interviews tears up, I know it's worked, and that really touched me deeply.
Mhm.
These are 5 Alan Watts questions just off the top of your head in a few words, just a couple words. Who started it all?
I don't know. I guess a fireball.
Nice. Fireball. I've never had that. Are we going to make it?
Are we what?
Are we going to make it?
Yeah, I think we are. But we have to accept the fact that it's possible we could destroy ourselves. But that doesn't mean existence stops. Something will.
Right.
Something goes on.
Where do we put it?
Where do we put it?
Yeah.
Wait, is there any antecedent to if?
No, again, he's just talking in general terms. So, you put the word it into the context you wanted. You did great on the first 2. Where do we put it?
Well, I guess I would put it into my writing.
Nice. Who's cleaning it up?
Okay, well, I am, but I get a lot of help from other people.
Nice.
Oh.
And is it serious?
Well, I mean, yeah, everything is serious, but at the same time, you can't take everything seriously, because if you did, you'd go mad. I mean,
Yeah, well, no, that was good, because it follows up this question. Well, Zappa said it great. He says, I'm serious about being not serious. But here's probably the most important serious question. Which way should toilet paper come off the roll? Over or under?
well, I do it both ways depending on
all right.
I don't really think about it much, and then I notice that I've done it differently. So
tell me something good you never had and you never want.
Something good I never had and never want. Great wealth.
That's what I get? The 3 answers I get the most? Fame, money, and heroin.
Well, I don't want heroin either.
If you were in a vat of vomit up to your neck and someone threw a bag of shit at your face, what would you do?
Where do you come up with these questions? What would I do? I would reach for the nearest thing above me and try and get the hell out of there.
Yeah, reach it. That's good. Well, no, it's funny you ask, because the guy who taught me that question, which is sort of like a metaphor for life in a way, he's like a Damien Runyon kind of guy. Amazing history. But that was good. I've never had that reach one. So, Thornton Wilder in 1928 said, art is confession. Art is the secret told. But art is not only the desire to tell one's secret, it's the desire to tell it and hide it at the same time. Patrick, you laid your cards on the table. Yeah, it's an amazing quote. You've laid your cards on the table for over 2 hours. I'm really grateful, not insinuating you haven't answered this, but what's it really all about for you?
I guess for me, it's just about leaving behind a question that other generations will perhaps answer, but then generate another question. it's just an ongoing
Yeah.
process, and
Yeah.
it won't end with me.
That
So,
is totally that's total McLuhan too. He says, I'm just seeking new metaphors and new questions.
mhm.
But see, if you're in the academic world, you're in the literature world, people want you to nail it. Here's how it is. And yeah, that was beautiful. What's the cultural shift you see developing today that inspires you?
Well, I'm not quite sure how to formulate this, but what inspires me is a kind of alternative globalism, if you will.
Yeah.
Aside from economic globalization, which has led to inequality, just a quick anecdote. I was in Bucharest once, and for a conference thing, and these people would come up to us. This was like in the early '90s or something, and they would say, "Oh, can you send us anthologies of American literature and so forth and so on because we don't have anything." And then I talk to people and they're talking about how bad the internet is, how it's destroying people's power of thought and so forth and so on. I always remember those people because now I know they can get online and they can download novels and for nothing because there's sites, all kinds of crazy sites out there. And there's so much stuff. And I mean, something is going on. I mean, I'm on this thing called Academia EDU, and it has a thing where readers, I put a bunch of my books on there in digital forms that can be downloaded. I don't, not the more recent ones, but and I'll go through this thing, and there's people have downloaded this book, and they're from, I mean, there was one the other day from the Ukraine, China, I mean, all over the place. And I mean, the idea that people all over this world are reading me, I mean, it's not vast numbers of people, you understand. This is a revolution, and this gives me hope because despite the efforts to block that, to regulate it, and I'm not against necessarily some rational regulation, but on the whole, I think it's very, very powerful. And despite all the negative stuff that may come out of it, that's, to me, this is the kind of cultural revolution going on under us that most people don't even grasp. Access on a global scale that's altered in a matter of a couple of decades.
Yeah, beautiful. In fact, one of my major teachers said, everybody's saying .com all the time, .com. They go, what does com stand for? He says, communism. He says, there's nothing more communistic than the internet. It's like, we're sharing everything, It's really quite a metaphor to
He's
think
right.
about.
I like that, actually.
He is right. He is right. That is true. .com, it stands for communism. And then when you think, the hippies on LSD invented the internet, and then the CIA hijacked it out of them, and we're still reinventing it constantly. And what Colbert say about Elon Musk? He says he's buying Twitter for $43 billion. It's like, why doesn't he feed the homeless for 43 with this $43 billion? But it is what we learn in the McLuhan world is it has services and disservices. Rather than saying something's good or bad and make a value judgment, have suspended judgment. And back to the word that you've used a lot is understanding, and try to understand how it's shaping our behavior.
Yeah. Well, the thing is too, is that everything has shaped our behavior in the past. There's always been negative sides to everything,
Yeah. Yep. And then how do you flip that? How do you flip a breakdown into a breakthrough? How do you flip a rejection into a redirection?
Yeah.
Which you've said really well today. Patrick, it's been an honor and a pleasure. And the last question is, what gives you the most optimism?
Well, I already answered that because that's what gives me the most, what I just said about
what you just said. Yeah.
It's kind of digital revolution.
Yeah, I got to push the digital revolution. Yeah. Well, it's been fun because this is truly an amazing phenomenon. We've been on live TV worldwide. And it's been truly enlightening, Patrick. I really appreciate this time. And I sure would love to do another salon with you just exclusively on cinema someday and
Okay, that'd
other
be
topics
great.
in James Joyce and literature and Blake too. You know, we have a Carl Jung reading club, and one of our members is totally Blakean. She's
Mhm.
just like Blake. And I hope our discussion will never end, but I'm going to hit the end button now.
Okay.
And once again, thank you